What's up, Internet? It's Fancy Quant, and today we're going to talk about the New York journey of Fancy Quant and how much I absolutely love New York. I'm just going to talk about my story, how I got to New York, how I enjoyed New York, and also why I ended up leaving New York. Again, more or less from a finance, banking, quant perspective here. But anyways, let's just dive on in. Okay, so the way that my whole New York journey got started is I was working and living in Dallas. My first quant job, I loved it. The culture, the company, the friends, right? I had a lot going on for me in Dallas. But a recruiter came along. They offered me almost double my salary of Dallas to work in New York City. And basically it was an offer I could not refuse. So I was like, all right, I'll interview. I'll go through the process. And I did it and I loved it. And I was just so excited to make a lot more money. And I'd always wanted to work in New York City, right? There's always this dream for me of working on Wall Street, right? Going to work in a suit, actually being physically on Wall Street itself. And we're going to talk about how I ended up accomplishing that goal here in a second. But in general, all right, I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed the interview. And so I ended up accepting it. My last day for every job that I've ever worked thus far, I've never had a break between my job I used to work and my new job. So I ended my Dallas job on a Friday. I packed up all of my stuff on the weekend, and then I just boarded a plane on Sunday. I flew out to New York City. The company I was working with was putting me up, so I was living in a hotel to live there, and that was a whole nightmare in itself. Stories to tell. But I ended up going to New York City. I've never been before. I don't know what to expect. I've never been in these massive cities. So I just had a suitcase and my stuff, and I flew out on a Sunday. And I'm like frantically Googling because I don't take public transport normally, right? I'm an American. I drive my car everywhere. But when you live in New York City, especially when you're just like dropping everything, packing your stuff and moving, it's a little nerve-wracking. I don't know what to expect. I'm hoping it goes well. Am I going to get lost? Am I going to get mugged, right? You just don't know. So I packed it all up and I had one suitcase and a backpack. And I got to New York City late on a Sunday night. I think it was like, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And by the time I got all my stuff, I got to the hotel, it was like 9:30, 10, 11. I don't remember. It's been a while, but the experience was interesting. I took a bus from LaGuardia to the train station. Luckily, there were some really nice people there I started just chatting with, and they were tourists, but they had been to New York many other times and used to live there. And so I explained, I've never been here. I don't know where I'm going. They were really nice and explained that they were going to the same spot I was going to. And so I was able to follow them and take the same bus with them where I met them. And then they told me where to get on the subway. And then I took the subway to Long Island City, so LIC, and that is where I was staying. The whole thing fell apart, though, somewhat when I showed up. The company that was paying for me to stay in the hotel, they didn't book my hotel. So I showed up in New York City with all of my stuff. I have nowhere to live. I'm trying to talk to the hotel. They're like, please call your company. So I'm like on the phone on a Sunday night, trying to get a hold of the guy that's responsible for this. Of course, he's with his family, doesn't really care that I'm calling on a Sunday. But luckily, I just threw it on my credit card and it all ended up working out for the most part. And I ended up living in this hotel. It's called The Borough. I really enjoyed staying there, minus the fact that there was no refrigerator. So I had this awesome view. I was staying in a hotel room with a massive king bed. I shot some YouTube videos there from way back in the day. But I had this view, I'd be able to look out of my hotel room and I could actually see Manhattan across the water from me. So Long Island City is part of Queens. You can look across and see Manhattan. Just a really amazing view, an amazing experience. It was a little crazy. I was really lucky though. I think it was like the next night or the night after, I messaged a buddy of mine and said, hey, we went to the same financial engineering program. I know you live in New York City. I'm moving there for a job. I'm going to be there this week. Would you mind just grabbing dinner with me? And so we went out to dinner, and I'm sure for them it was no big deal, right? They were Chinese. They're from China. They're used to big cities. I don't know if it's really that big of a shock for them. But for me, coming from like smaller cities and even Dallas where it's very spread out, it's kind of new and interesting on how you get around New York. and just learning all the different intricacies of the city itself and like the buildings and the streets and the maps and everything. It's a lot to absorb when you just show up in the middle of the night and then you're just working there on Monday. But I really appreciate that friend. They made the transition easier for me. We just went to dinner, chatted, talked about school. I worked with his cousin in Dallas, so we had that conversation. But it was awesome. And then I worked in LIC itself while I was living in this hotel. And then eventually the company wanted to get me out of the hotel because it was expensive, and they wanted to move me up to Manhattan somewhat. So they agreed to put me on the Upper East Side, which is a super nice area of New York City, with the expectation I had, I think, like a month or so, month and a half maybe, to get out of my, my contracted position where they were going to have me living in all these housing. Within that month, I needed to get out and find my own place and pay my own bills. So I was okay with that. They moved me to the Upper East Side, and I lived there for, I think, another 2 weeks. So it was like 2 weeks in a hotel, 2 weeks on the Upper East Side, and absolutely loved the Upper East Side. My company was paying $4,000 a month for me to stay on the bottom floor for most of it. They eventually moved me to the top one for like, I think, the last week or something, or last few days, or I don't know. Something happened and they moved me. But it's what you would expect of New York. So it's $4,000 Upper East Side. So if you don't know, that's on the east side of Central Park. I was like 6 blocks maybe from Central Park. So I was able to, like, on the weekends, go walk to the park. I could spend time at the park. I could relax. I could enjoy New York City. It was a blast. The apartment itself, though, was, I don't know. New York is old and rickety, and it's falling apart at the seams, but people don't really understand that, I think, as a tourist a lot of times. The apartment I was staying in at $4,000 a month, there was like water stains on the wall because I believe one of the neighbors upstairs, when they would shower, it would drip. And so this is a rental property, so I mentioned something to them, but like, it's not my place. But like, I'm going to let you know that there's some issues. The doors would like stick. They wouldn't close all the way, because I think a lot of the structuring in the building had kind of shifted. And then it was a tiny apartment. It was like 300 square feet. You'd walk in, and there's a little strip in front of you with like a kitchen. We'll call it a kitchen. It was like a little tiny stovetop, I believe. I don't think there was an oven in it, but there might have been. And then it was stocked with all of the, plates and utensils and things you needed to cook. So I would like buy a few things to kind of get me through the day. And then on the left, you would have my bed with just enough space to get around it, and like a dresser with a TV that they provided. And then if you went to the right when you walked in the door, there was just the bathroom. So a little shower and a toilet. Again, I'm living like in a sardine can. It's itty bitty tiny. It's rickety. When they moved me upstairs, there were these stairs that went up, this little set of stairs. My suitcase barely fit up the stairs. But the stairs, I remember, where the stairs connected to the upper landing, was like sunken in. And so it was like the wood was falling apart. I think one of the beams failed, but again, it was safe enough, I guess, in their eyes. And this was a deluxe apartment up there. And so it went from like 300 square feet to maybe, 325, 350 square feet. It had a little living room space. And again, this one was even more classic. It had its own separate bedroom. So now the original apartment was all one kind of living area, right? You just there's no doors or anything. The new one had its own bedroom with a door, but the bed had about 3 inches of space on either side, just enough so you could tuck the sheet in, but not enough so you could do anything else. And so you have this bed just wedged into this little tiny room with a wall kind of thing. Anyways, it was tiny. Again, I am super, super frugal. New York City is super expensive. So I was eating like Domino's pizza super regularly in McDonald's because it was so cheap. I would buy, for example, a Domino's pizza, and I would eat half of it or a quarter of it or whatever for one meal, like for dinner, and then I would take it to work the next day for lunch. Again, I'm super cheap. If you guys don't know me, I'm super cheap even today, even though I make really good money. But in general, it was very frugal living. I worked in LIC. Again, so put perspective on this, right? At the same time, I just left my entire life in Dallas. So my wife is living in Dallas still. She's still working in Dallas. I was able to fly back every other weekend. So every 2 weeks, I would fly back to Dallas on Friday night. And then I'd fly back to New York City on Sundays. So I'd get like a day and a half to see my wife, and then back at the grind. So we were convinced. We had to move. We had to pack everything up. Right. I only had a month of essentially free living there. But it was great. And working in LIC, I worked in I think the tallest skyscraper really in LIC. So for those of you that don't know, LIC as a neighborhood is more like a living area where there's lots of like apartments and condos and things down through there. It's kind of underdeveloped. There's not a lot of shopping. It's not necessarily that nice either. It's a little sketchy, but it's New York City, so it's kind of all a little sketchy. But I was in the top of this building working for a bank as a consultant. And one of the nights I remember very vividly was staying late and working on the very, very top, like executive floor. So you could see out over all of New York City in all directions because we're at the top of this building and we have the entire area for this executive suites. And we're in there coding and helping, documentation and putting models together. It was a blast. It was amazing. That job in itself was a little bit of a nightmare, but anyways, it was a blast. And the first day I even showed up for work. Of course, I am Fancy Quant, so I show up in a 3-piece blue suit, ready to rock and roll, I went down to the office of the consulting firm I worked at. It was just, I don't know, for me it was heavenly and somewhat like a dream come true. I remember having like my suit on and like my work bag and just like crossing the street right in the middle, jaywalking like a standard New Yorker. There was, I think, Victoria's Secret's on the side, like a massive department store, and there's like taxis and cabs going around, and there's this massive, really nice building with glass all on the walls and the consulting name on it. And I went in, and they had like fruit baskets everywhere. You had fruit for the day. They had espresso machines and like fridges just stocked with beverages. We were lowly quants. We weren't allowed to partake in most of this stuff. But it was a blast. I had a lot of fun. I met my manager there. He met me there. He took me then to the client's office. And again, like I talked about, in those high rises, looking at everything. My project changed though partway through, and I ended up moving to Wall Street. So same client, but I was sitting on Wall Street. I was actually on Wall Street on the water. It was like, to me, it was just like a dream come true. I'd always wanted to work on Wall Street and be a banker. And like, you have all these images, you walk past the stock exchange every single day. There's people out there. But the weird part on Wall Street is that it's dead. So for those of you that don't know, most of these big banks have closed all their offices on Wall Street and they've moved them up to Midtown. That's where I ended up working later, which I'll talk about. But Midtown is a fun and exciting, vibrant place. Wall Street in the bottom there, it's just dead. It's essentially like a museum of this is how America used to be when, trading was big in the 80s and the 90s. And then this is like this monument of like the death and museum here of Wall Street. Like it's just, there's not much there. But I worked on Wall Street. The building though was old as well. So everything in New York is old. I just remember walking in and it's like this massive flat floor. And the roof had like the ghetto tiles with like the water damage on them. And the carpet was super old and raggedy. And different parts of the carpet were different types of carpet because they just patched things up. You could see everybody across the entire floor too, like 100 employees all working at the same time. Somewhat like the movies, I guess, where you see them and it's like everyone's grinding away, except for these aren't really nice buildings. These are ran down ghetto buildings that a few banks have as their back offices. So these aren't the main headquarter offices for these firms. They didn't want the consultants, working in these nice areas, so they would put us away on Wall Street. But for me, it made the experience so much better. So I even had a blast going to New York. I met one of my good friends there from the industry. We had a blast just working together and dealing with a lot of the nonsense that you deal with. But New York has this very eclectic-y feel to it. So it's dirty. The subways are dirty. As you know, I ride the subways everywhere. Within like a first week or so, you figure out the subway pretty quick because you use it to get everywhere. So that's kind of its own thing. It was good. And then stepping back for a second here, right, I ended up moving my wife. So I flew back to Dallas on I think a Friday, and my father-in-law and brother-in-law helped. and we packed everything up in a Penske moving truck, and I put a trailer on the back with one car and had my wife, I had my father-in-law and my brother-in-law driving the other car, and we just moved everything all the way across country. So I drove from Dallas, Texas, within like a day and a half up to New York City, got my new apartment, and moved into Weehawken, New Jersey. So Weehawken itself was another just really fun experience. So living in New York City, like I mentioned, for this rickety, dinky, tiny, 300 square foot, little apartment, you're spending $4,000 a month. That's what the company is paying. So I lived in LIC hotel, $200 something a night. Then I moved to LIC. Then I moved to Weehawken, New Jersey. To give you perspective on price here, how nuts it is, I had friends from grad school that were living there paying $1,200 a month, which is cheap. But $1,200 a month gets you a room in a multi-room apartment. So you're living with like 2, 3, maybe 4 people all together because you're all just trying to make it work. That was not for me, okay? I was not going to do that. I was married. So I got a really nice apartment over in Weehawken, New Jersey. I was on the water. So to describe Weehawken to you, there's the tunnel that goes across from Midtown in Manhattan, from the Port Authority, across to New Jersey, and I was like the second stop down. There was nice multi-million-dollar condos all along, and there were some few big, nice apartment buildings, which I stayed in. And then there's a cliff that goes up to the mainland, and that's fairly poor and ran down. So we stayed on the bottom waterfront views out of my apartment. I could see just amazing view of Midtown, which is where I ended up working long-term in my career for that New York stint. But you had amazing views. It was beautiful. Again, I was paying, I think, $3,800-ish. So again, about $4,000 to live in New Jersey. I had a 2-bedroom apartment, though. I had a nice kitchen and a living room, and then there was like a bedroom on each side of it, so you could have privacy and separation. I believe there were 2 bathrooms as well, which was really nice. There might have just been 1. I can't quite remember, but it was great. It was wonderful. But again, you're not really saving money when you live in New York. Okay, the cost of living was double for me in New York City versus Dallas. Your salary, again, like I said, it was almost double, but realistically, I was making overall less money and standard of living was lower. But you have to realize you make a sacrifice to live in New York City. So being the fun Big Apple. Anyways, I worked out my consulting gig and it was all right. And I ended up moving to Jersey and I finished it out. And I was just done with the whole thing. Like, I was done with the consulting side. I didn't want to do it anymore. I was just tired of the whole situation I was in. So I ended up leaving and ended up working for a new bank, a big multinational bank. I still work for them now in Dallas. But I ended up working for them. They had an awesome office in Midtown. It was kind of tucked away. I was very close to Central Park, which was just north of me. And then just west of us was Fifth Avenue with all the really cool, expensive stores. And of course, there was Rockefeller Center. So one of the fun things I would like to do on my lunch breaks is I would eat my lunch I would bring, of course, and then I would actually walk down to Rockefeller Center. And there's a Nintendo World in there, and I would go in, and they had like gaming systems and like tourists everywhere. And you could stop and play like the new Wii or the Nintendo Switch or the Wii U or whatever. So I'd go there and have fun. There was also, I think, St. Patrick's Cathedral right across from there. Work is a little hectic. New York's a little crazy. And for me, I would go on breaks or walks for lunch, for other parts of the day. And I had my own pew. There was a pew in the cathedral that I sat at. So it's usually not that busy. You go in, it's fairly quiet. It's a church. And then there's all of these like tourists kind of wandering around. And no one's really sitting. There's not service going on at these times. And so I would sit at my pew, and I always really enjoyed the peace and quiet at the cathedral. It's an amazing cathedral. I think the Kennedys were married there as well, but it's just really beautiful with the marble and the decorations and everything. But I'd go and I'd sit, and I would just enjoy the quiet time and think and kind of unwind and relax. So for me, finding a quiet place in New York City was very important. Living in Weehawken, New Jersey, again, your weekly commute and everything is crazy. There's tons of people. You're being crammed into subways, and there's gross, dirty stuff everywhere in New York City. But being able to live in Weehawken outside of the city and be able to see the city and the beauty and the river and everything, right, it was amazing. But it had my peace and quiet, and I definitely needed that. The other part I wanted just to mention here when I was living there by myself before my wife came, it was very lonely. So you hear a lot of people talk about New York City is crazy busy, there's people everywhere, and yet there's this big population of people that are very lonely. I think this has to do with the fact that there's so many people, you don't know everybody, you can't trust everybody, right? You're all packed in like sardines, it's stressful, there's all kinds of stuff going on, there's noises. It's not a really good environment a lot of times for your mental health. And so I think a lot of people end up like isolated in their apartments and their jobs, and it's a fairly lonely place to be in a lonely city. I don't know. It's just a weird place. The people there were actually more friendly than I expected because people will say people in New York are very rude. This is not necessarily true. So I'll point this out real quick. In New York City, everybody's busy and it's crazy and it's stressful, and a lot of you are working finance jobs, for example, or tech jobs or whatever, and you're working long hours. So we're not going to be the most friendly people after you get off a 12-hour shift, right? Just not going to happen. But that being said, I ran into a bunch of people that are like, hey, I'm so-and-so, and, we get to talking somehow, and we have the commonalities, and people would like to connect and go to coffee and dinners and things. I thought it was a little weird and a little, over-intensive, like, I don't know you, and now you're inviting me, or me and my wife to dinner. It's just a little odd, but people are fairly nice for the most part. The locals, when I lived there, you get very irritated with all the tourists, because, right, this is like where I live and work and this is my life. And then you have like thousands of people from all over the place, like in the way, like standing on the sidewalk, like looking up at buildings and like pointing. And there's a group of 4 of them and they take the entire sidewalk. Like, I'm late to work. I need to get there. You're in the way. Like, please move, get out of the way. Tourists are kind of a burden, I think, when you live in New York City. Not a big fan of tourists in general, but also, to go back to like the church and like Rockefeller Center a lot, it's awesome to go during the holidays, but from a work perspective, I stopped going, for example, to St. Pat's because there's so many tourists during Christmas season. So it just fills with people. There's people everywhere. You can't sit. There's no peace and quiet. So typically it's best if you live and work there, you start just avoiding like the main tourist attraction areas because they're difficult. And so sometimes I would route my subway route a different route because I knew it was longer, more stops or whatever, but I could actually get from point A to point B far quicker than actually taking my more direct route because of all the tourists. I had to go through many of these tourist areas like Times Square and whatnot to travel to work or to get to a different location, for example, to get like my shoes repaired or pick up clothes or something. It's just a nightmare. But in general, I had a lot of fun in New York City. I loved working on Wall Street. I had a blast living there. And then the question is going to come to me, which is, Dimitri, why did you leave? So one more thing before we get to that is that New Jersey it's called the Garden State for a reason. It's very pretty. It's very lush and green. We used to go out and go hiking. I really wanted to move out to I think it's called Montclair, which is a little bit further out in Jersey. The prices, though, of houses is astronomical. It's expensive. But these are quiet, nice neighborhoods. They're well kept. I think lower crime rate for the most part, right? It's just an amazing place to live, but the cost is just so expensive. And then my wife and I started thinking about, we want to start a family, have kids and whatnot. If you have kids, you have to put them through school. Schools there aren't very good, so then you probably go to private schools, and then that's thousands of dollars for these schools. And then you start realizing the cost of childcare in New York City and New Jersey is even higher than everywhere else, which is crazily expensive on its own. And so you end up in a position where it's being in New York City for a career and a job is amazing. Being there when you're single is amazing. Lots of activities, lots of opportunities, lots of jobs. But when you come to New York City as a family and you have more people involved with it, it gets too expensive and it's not necessarily as much of a benefit as it would be when you're young, because you can kind of move around and find cheaper places to live, and you can jump job to job. There's lots of places to work on the finance and banking side. And then we decided it's just too expensive, and my company there had an office in Dallas. I asked if I could transfer back to Dallas, which was half the price. So I turned out making a lot more money for cost of living and all that, and my salary comps and all that, to be in Dallas. So I ended up moving back to Dallas. But I love New York. I lived somewhat a fancy, swanky, Wall Streety lifestyle that you would imagine. A few highlights just to wrap this podcast up here is I remember, like, I drive my car, so I don't drive a fancy car or anything, but you can imagine it's fancy if you want. But like driving up to my apartment, and it's like the gates scan your car, and these big gates open up, and then you roll in. As you're driving through the parking lot, there's like a Bentley parked over on the side. There's some other like really nice Mercedes and other types of cars. And then having like an amazing view. So one day at work, I worked from home. I love to work from home, even in New York City. Our apartment was shaped like a big U, and the U opened up to the river and then Midtown across the way. I was sitting on like the patio there with like trees and greenery around, having my laptop up on this table and just being able to like peacefully work and enjoy the city, but not have all the stress around you. And then again, I mentioned kind of that fun experience in the skyscraper in LIC, working at late nights. Other things that were just more fun from a career perspective was being able to help people as a consultant. So I was working with someone at the business. They had a model. They had regulatory requirements they were trying to meet. They had some issues and findings, and they didn't know how to address them. Being able to come in as a time series expert, which is more or less my strength, and going through how to fix things and running tests with them and helping them side by side, and doing this at like 1, 2 in the morning as we're wrapping up reports. And then, of course, it was a lady, so on the way home, I just rode the subway with her to be nice, right? Have a friend to go with, helps reduce crime or whatnot. And then I dropped her off at her stop, and then she left and went wherever she lived. And then I, took the subway back home. But that was a lot of fun. And then as a consultant too, we had a few parties or a few dinners, I guess, at the headquarter building there, and being able to sit on the rooftop and you see all of New York City around you. So you're right in the middle of Manhattan at this place, and there's all these skyscrapers around you. You can see the cars and hear the noise, and you're eating well-made, like 4 or 5 star food that they brought in and catered. And I mean, it wasn't like the world's best food, but it was really good. It was fairly well done. I somewhat gauge my other employers to that. Like, you need to, up the bar here and treat your employees well. But in general, it was a blast. It was exactly what I would expect of a New York experience. The Wall Street lifestyle, dressing in suits, walking the city, riding the subway. It's not all glamour though either. The subways are super, super dirty. You see the craziest people. The homeless people are everywhere. They're a bit intense. Man, I've seen bad things with homeless people, but anyways, the city was fun. The life was enjoyable. I would highly recommend New York City to those in finance because it's such a finance hub. It's a big opportunity for careers, to meet people, to network, to change jobs when you're younger and single. But again, when you start getting older and you want to live in like Connecticut or New Jersey, and you want to live out in like a suburb, the costs get really expensive. The commutes are very expensive. Again, if you can work from home, it's definitely worth it in these types of situations. But anyways, thank you for listening to my story on New York City, working as a Wall Street banker, as I'm going to put it in air quotes here, because I was just a financial quant doing math and stats for a bank, but it happened to be on Wall Street, and it was a lot of fun. So anyways, thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time.